Okay, and I really believe that's the case of all of you, or maybe the great majority of you in PNU. You all want to study because you want a brighter future for yourself. So the motivation is deep inside you. That's intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, extrinsic motivation comes from the environment, as you said. If somebody is pressuring you to study, if somebody rewards you for getting a high grade or getting a high grade in a quiz, or because there's pressure in a group to participate, that's extrinsic motivation. External, that's external. I think a good example of that are Korean teenagers, Korean students. Koreans, when they are in Korea, they study well, they behave well. But when they go out of Korea, they come from, when they go to other countries, they suddenly become lazy. In my experience as a teacher in PNU, we had several Korean students. Many of them were lazy. There was only one Korean student that we had who was studious. And I think it has to do with Korean society. So much of motivation in Korea comes from the culture, comes from the society. There's pressure from the parents, there's pressure from society. Once they go out of that society, there's no more pressure. What happens is, because of the external pressure, the extrinsic motivation, because of the pressure and influence from outside, they no longer have intrinsic motivation. So when they go out of their society, there's no more pressure, no more extrinsic motivation. They become lazy. Okay? But in the case of PNU students, you all want to study because you want to have a bright future for yourself and for the people that you love. That's intrinsic motivation. Another category of motivation would be functional and integrative. Functional and integrative. When we say functional motivation, it means you want to learn the language because you want to do something with the language. You have a specific purpose. For example, I had a friend who saw that there were many pretty Korean girls. And so the guy decided to learn Korean so that he could hit it up with Korean women. Or there's another person whose motivation was to evangelize. So he learned the language of a particular group. Then in the case of Alberto Schumann's case study, he only wanted English to be able to work, to pick apples and work for his family, earn a living in the United States for his family back in South America. So for picking apples, how much English do you need in order to be able to do that? Not much English. And so because of his motivation, of that kind of motivation, he learned only this kind of English. Now, functional motivation can cause people to learn just a few language or a lot of language. For example, if you are a doctoral student, you want to have access to German literature about medicine, about uh, psychology, or about the Hebrew texts of the Bible, that's your functional motivation, it's probable that you would learn a lot of German, particularly CALP German, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, CALP German. So you would know a lot of terms. You would be high in reading German, but maybe not so much in speaking German, everyday German. Maybe not so. On the other hand, there's a kind of motivation called integrative motivation. In integrative motivation, a person, a language learner, wishes to learn a language because they want to become part of the culture and society of the target language. So some people want to learn Korean because they want to participate in Korea. They want to become part of that society. That's integrative motivation. And integrative motivation would cause you to learn a lot of BICS language, basic interpersonal communication skills, meaning everyday language. Can you tell us, who can tell us about their motivation for learning English or for learning any other language? Anyone? Yes,
And in
Patrick.
my case po, I already have a superficial knowledge and application of the English language, but I want to further it because in my online communities that I am in, English is the most commonly used language po. So yeah, my comprehension and say practice and application of the language is not yet on their level po, per se. So that's what I want to achieve.
Thank you. Anyone else? Who among you is trying to learn another language? Jen and Nicole.
So, good morning, sir. I actually lived in Camarines Norte po, in Bicol for 7 years. So, at first, I really didn't want to learn the language since it's quite hard. But later on, I did force myself to learning it since a lot of people are speaking in Bicol or in the Bicolano dialect. So, of course, I wanted to socialize and communicate with them. So, I practice a lot, and then I would always talk to native speakers to practice myself in learning the dialect po.
By the way, don't call it dialect, call it language. It's not a dialect.
Yes po, sir.
Thank
Sorry
you,
po.
Janen. That's integrative motivation. In the case of Patrick, it's a mixture of functional and integrative. Okay? Actually, you can mix intrinsic, extrinsic, and functional and integrative. For example, your parents are requiring you to learn this particular language so that you could access medical information on the internet. That is external functional motivation. On the other hand, if you move to a particular place and your parents are requiring you, they are pressuring you to learn a particular language so that you could participate in the community, then that is external integrative motivation. Of course, if it's your own motivation, then it would be intrinsic functional or intrinsic integrative motivation. Anyone else? Okay, let's go on. Another one is self confidence. When a person has self confidence, then the affective filter is down, and the that allows the input to go into the language acquisition device, and the learner will benefit from it. On the other hand, if the learner has very little self confidence, then there's a tendency for the affective filter to go up and prevent language input from going into the language acquisition device. Okay, now it's possible to still learn a language, but not through the language acquisition device. So maybe the way you would learn a language would not be as optimal as when the language input goes into the language acquisition device. Okay, and then finally you have anxiety. Anxiety refers to the worry that you have. If there is high anxiety, maybe because you're afraid that you would be laughed at, maybe you're afraid that you would fail, or any other form of anxiety, that would also prevent the entry of the input into the language acquisition device because the affective filter is up. On the other hand, if you have low anxiety, then the affective filter is down. It allows the input to go into the lab. Now, some researchers talk about optimal anxiety, a little bit of anxiety to motivate you to try to learn. Okay, optimal anxiety. Okay, let's talk about pedagogical implications of these. Well, first, the classroom should be a source of comprehensible input, especially if it is not available outside. What do you call the situation in learning English where comprehensible input is not available outside? What do you call that situation where you learn English but it's not available outside of the classroom? So you are learning English as a foreign language. But when you learn English, and you're in America or in Australia and you're learning English, and there's a lot of English available outside the classroom, it's called learning English as a second language. Okay. In the case of the Philippines, it's varied. There are places where there's lots of input outside of the classroom, and there are cases where there's very little English outside of the classroom. So it's mixed in the case of the Philippines. But for teaching English, according to Krashen, there should always be a lot of comprehensible input inside the classroom. And Krashen doesn't even like a grammar-based syllabus where there is a topic of the day, because for him, that limits limits the topics you could talk about, the kind of input that would be available. Okay. So this one here, the classrooms should be a source of comprehensible input. That's related to the input hypothesis, that input should be comprehensible. Now, with regards to the affective filter hypothesis, Krashen prescribes that the classroom should be a non-threatening environment conducive to learning. The classroom should be a non-threatening environment so that students' affective filter would be down. Okay, a really good way to do this is to engage in what is called community language learning, CLL. It was pioneered by a priest counselor, and you learn English in a circle. You're all in a circle. Somebody would speak in their native language, and the facilitator would translate it into English. There's no pressure to speak in English, but the idea is as the sessions go on and on, the participants learn a lot of English. And there's no condemnation, there's no correction happening, so that students would not be afraid. So the classroom should be a non-threatening environment. Okay, one kind of teaching approach for this is community language learning. Krashen still believes that it's still okay to teach grammar, but when you teach grammar, you're only helping language learning, not language acquisition. However, when you know the principles of grammar, and you because of that you are able to monitor your speech, you speak with well-formed sentences. Another term for grammatical sentences would be well-formed sentences. Okay, bear that in mind. So because you are able to monitor your speech, you are able to produce grammatical sentences. Now, the sentences that you produce, which are grammatical, they serve as comprehensible input for you. So, learning grammatical principles do not directly enable you to acquire a language, but they enable you to learn a language. They enable you to speak well-formed sentences, and those well-formed sentences produce comprehensible input for you. Okay, so there's still a role of teaching grammar in Krashen's five hypotheses. Okay,